What if the most dangerous threat facing the modern world is not political, economic, or even military? What if it is something far older, far more patient, and far more difficult to recognize? For years, one message remained largely confined to private conversations, closed-door discussions, and warnings that many people dismissed before they ever considered them. But now, that message has moved into the open. And according to Father Chad Ripperger, the reason is deeply unsettling, not because the danger is new, but because it may have reached a point where remaining silent is no longer an option. Think about that for a moment. A man who has spent decades studying spiritual warfare, serving as a priest, and participating in some of the most disturbing cases imaginable, is not stepping forward to share comforting predictions. He is stepping forward because he believes something has changed. And before you decide whether that sounds dramatic or exaggerated, consider a simple question. What if the most significant changes in society are the ones that happen so gradually that nobody notices them until they are already complete? That is exactly where this story begins. Because according to this warning, the greatest crisis of our time is not that people believe the wrong things. It is that many people have stopped paying attention altogether. Look around for a second. Not at the headlines. Not at the arguments dominating social media. Not even at the endless stream of breaking news that disappears as quickly as it arrives. Instead, look at the patterns. Look at what is celebrated today that would have shocked previous generations. Look at what is normalized. Look at what is considered unquestionable. Then ask yourself a simple question that almost nobody asks anymore. Where is all of this leading? That question matters because every civilization follows a direction. Cultures do not drift randomly. Individuals do not change overnight. Everything moves somewhere. Every belief produces consequences. Every value shapes behavior. Every behavior creates a future. And according to Ripperger, the future being quietly constructed around us is not accidental. But before we get there, there is something important you need to understand. Throughout his years working in spiritual warfare ministry, he observed patterns. At first, those patterns were relatively predictable. Cases of oppression, possession, and spiritual disturbance often shared similar characteristics. The entry points were familiar. Occult involvement, deeply destructive habits, rejection of faith, serious spiritual wounds. The situations were serious, sometimes terrifying, but they were also contained. Then something changed, not suddenly, not dramatically, slowly, and that is what made it so dangerous. Because instead of seeing isolated individuals falling into spiritual confusion, he began witnessing something larger. The scope widened. The boundaries expanded. What once appeared to be personal struggles increasingly looked like cultural movements. That distinction changes everything. Because if a problem affects only individuals, solutions remain individual. But when an entire culture begins moving in the same direction, the stakes become much higher. And according to this warning, that is precisely what is happening now. A civilization that once understood certain moral boundaries is gradually forgetting why those boundaries existed in the first place. A society that once recognized the importance of family increasingly treats it as optional. A culture that once valued sacrifice increasingly worships convenience. And perhaps most importantly, a world that once searched for truth increasingly questions whether truth even exists. At first glance, these changes may seem unrelated. But what if they are connected? What if they are pieces of a much larger pattern? That is where the warning becomes unsettling. Because Ripperger argues that spiritual realities do not operate randomly. They operate strategically. And strategy always has a target. For decades, many people assumed that if evil existed, its greatest advantage would be remaining hidden. In fact, that idea became one of the most common assumptions about spiritual warfare. If people stop believing in danger, they stop protecting themselves from it. The strategy makes sense. Convince people that something does not exist, and resistance collapses naturally. For much of the modern era, that approach appeared remarkably successful. Discussions about spiritual warfare faded from public life. Religious institutions reduced emphasis on it. Entire generations grew up without any meaningful understanding of spiritual protection. The supernatural became a topic reserved for movies, myths, and entertainment. And because that happened, many people stopped taking spiritual danger seriously. But, according to this warning, a surprising shift may now be occurring. The argument is not that concealment has ended because the threat disappeared. The argument is that concealment may no longer be necessary. Think about an immune system. When a healthy body encounters infection, the infection must move carefully. Resistance exists. Defenses respond. The battle is immediate, but remove those defenses and everything changes. The infection no longer needs to hide. It can advance openly. That comparison sits at the center of this message because, according to Ripperger, the spiritual antibodies that once protected communities have weakened dramatically. And once those defenses weaken, the nature of the attack changes as well. Suddenly things that once remained on the margins move toward the center. Ideas that would have been questioned become celebrated. Practices once considered dangerous become fashionable. Warnings become unpopular. Discernment becomes rare. And because all of this happens gradually, people adapt to each step without realizing how far they have traveled. That is the frightening part. Not that change occurs, but that it occurs invisibly. Imagine placing a person in the middle of a forest and asking them to identify the exact tree where they became lost. Most cannot do it. They remember walking. They remember turning. They remember moving forward. But they rarely recognize the precise moment when the path disappeared. According to this warning, modern culture may be experiencing something similar. The path did not vanish overnight. It disappeared one compromise at a time, one assumption at a time, one rationalization at a time. And because each step seemed small, the final destination now feels normal. But there is another layer to this story. And it is here that the warning becomes even more serious, because Ripperger insists that spiritual attacks rarely begin with dramatic manifestations. Instead, they begin with the very faculties that make us human, the intellect, the will, and the affections. At first, that may sound abstract. But stay with this, because understanding these three targets may explain far more about modern life than most people realize. Start with the intellect. The intellect exists to recognize truth, not personal truth, not subjective truth, truth itself, reality as it actually is. The ability to distinguish what is true from what is false, what is real from what is imagined, what is good from what merely appears good. Without that ability, every decision becomes unstable, because if truth becomes negotiable, then every conclusion becomes temporary, every belief becomes conditional, every conviction becomes vulnerable, and according to this warning, that vulnerability is exactly the point. Because a person who cannot identify truth cannot identify deception. And a person who cannot identify deception becomes extraordinarily easy to manipulate. Notice what happens when objective truth disappears from public conversation. Disagreements stop being debates about reality. They become competitions between preferences. Facts lose authority. Feelings gain authority. Evidence becomes secondary. Emotion becomes primary. And once that transition occurs, confusion spreads rapidly. Not because people are unintelligent, but because the tools required to evaluate reality have been weakened. That is the first target. But it is only the beginning. Because even if a person recognizes truth, another challenge remains: the ability to act on it. That is where the will enters the picture. The will is what allows someone to choose what is right even when doing so is difficult. And according to this warning, modern culture has become exceptionally skilled at weakening that capacity, not through force, through comfort. Think about how many systems now exist specifically to eliminate inconvenience. Food arrives instantly. Entertainment arrives instantly. Violation arrives instantly. Distraction arrives instantly. Every frustration can be escaped. Every moment of boredom can be interrupted. Every uncomfortable feeling can be avoided. At first, that sounds like progress. And in some ways, it is. But there is a hidden cost, because every time discomfort is removed automatically, opportunities for growth disappear alongside it. Patience weakens. Discipline weakens. Perseverance weakens. And eventually something subtle begins to happen. People know what they should do, but they struggle to do it. Not because they lack information, because they lack strength. The will becomes conditioned toward immediate gratification, toward convenience, toward comfort, toward the easiest available path. And that conditioning creates a problem. Because every meaningful achievement requires resistance. Every virtue requires effort. Every transformation requires sacrifice. A weak will may survive peaceful times, but it struggles in difficult ones. And according to this warning, difficult times may be exactly what lies ahead. Yet even that is not the final target. Because there is one more faculty that shapes everything else, perhaps the most powerful of all: what we love, what we desire, what moves us emotionally, the affections. And this is where the story becomes impossible to ignore. Because human beings do not ultimately move toward what they know. They move toward what they love. You can know something is true and still reject it. You can know something is harmful and still pursue it. Knowledge alone does not determine behavior. Desire does. Which means whoever shapes desire shapes destiny. And according to this warning, modern culture has become extraordinarily effective at directing desire away from what sustains people and toward what consumes them, not through obvious evil. Through counterfeits, because counterfeits are always more persuasive than direct opposites. A counterfeit resembles the real thing closely enough to gain trust. It looks familiar. It sounds familiar. It feels familiar. But it leads somewhere entirely different. And that according to this message, is the mechanism behind many of the deepest cultural changes occurring today. Real desires for connection become distorted. Real desires for meaning become redirected. Real desires for love become imitated. And because the imitation appears convincing, people often embrace it willingly. The result is not liberation. It is confusion. Not because people wanted confusion, because they mistook imitation for reality. Now, here is where everything begins coming together. Because attacks on the intellect. The will and the affections do not occur independently. They reinforce one another. Confuse truth, and choices become harder. Weaken choices, and desires become easier to manipulate. Corrupt desires, and truth becomes easier to reject. The cycle feeds itself, and once it gains momentum, reversing it becomes increasingly difficult. That is why Ripperger believes the current moment is unlike anything many people recognize. Because the battlefield is no longer confined to isolated incidents. It exists inside homes, inside schools, inside entertainment, inside technology, inside everyday life. Most people wake up inside the battlefield every morning without realizing they are standing on it. And that ignorance creates vulnerability, because you cannot defend what you do not know is under attack. You cannot rebuild what you do not realize is being dismantled. And according to this warning, something else is now emerging from that vulnerability. Something many people overlook completely. Something that may already exist inside millions of homes. Something so common that most families never question it. And yet, according to Ripperger, understanding it may be one of the most important steps toward understanding the larger battle itself. Because the next stage of this warning is not about abstract philosophy. It is about something concrete, something visible. What makes a danger truly effective is not its power. It is its ability to appear harmless. History proves this over and over again. The greatest threats rarely arrive announcing themselves. They arrive disguised as conveniences, opportunities, or harmless habits. That is why Father Chad Ripperger believes one of the most significant spiritual developments of our time is not something hidden in remote places. It is something sitting in living rooms, bedrooms, and pockets across the world. It is something most people interact with every day without a second thought. And before you assume this is merely a criticism of technology, stay with me, because the issue is much deeper than devices. The issue is formation. Every generation is shaped by something. Previous generations were shaped by family traditions, local communities, religious institutions, and direct human relationships. Today, however, much of that formation has been outsourced. Children spend thousands of hours consuming content created by people they will never meet. Adults absorb endless streams of information curated by algorithms whose primary goal is attention, not wisdom. The result is subtle but profound. People increasingly think they are choosing their beliefs independently, while their imaginations, desires, and assumptions are being shaped continuously by forces they barely notice. And that matters, because whoever forms the imagination eventually influences the future. Think about how powerful imagination really is. Before someone acts, they imagine. Before someone believes, they visualize. Before someone commits to a path, they picture what that path looks like. This means the battle for the future begins long before decisions are made. It begins in the imagination itself. According to this warning, modern culture has become extraordinarily effective at occupying that territory. Entertainment is no longer simply entertainment. Media is no longer simply media. Every story communicates values. Every image carries assumptions. Every message teaches something about reality, whether intentionally or not. At first, these influences seem insignificant because they arrive one piece at a time, one movie, one series, one social media trend, one viral idea. None appears powerful enough to transform a person's worldview. But influence rarely works through single moments. It works through repetition. What you encounter every day eventually feels normal. What feels normal eventually feels true. What feels true eventually guides behavior. And behavior repeated long enough becomes identity. That progression is why Ripperger believes many families underestimate the seriousness of the situation. They recognize dramatic threats while overlooking gradual ones. They watch for crises while ignoring formation. Yet formation determines how people respond when crises eventually arrive. A person whose beliefs have been weakened slowly may not realize it until those beliefs are tested. A family whose spiritual foundation has eroded gradually may not notice until pressure exposes the cracks. And according to this warning, pressure is increasing. Not necessarily through dramatic persecution, not necessarily through catastrophic events, but through constant cultural pressure. Pressure to conform, pressure to compromise, pressure to remain silent, pressure to treat conviction as intolerance and truth as preference. These pressures operate quietly because they are woven into everyday life. Most people do not experience them as attacks. They experience them as expectations. That distinction is crucial because when pressure becomes normal, resistance feels strange. Standing firm feels uncomfortable. Conviction feels costly. And that is exactly why preparation matters. Preparation is not something people value during easy times. It becomes valuable when difficulty arrives. The person who learns survival before the storm stands a very different chance than the person who waits until the storm begins. The same principle applies spiritually. Strength developed beforehand matters more than strength desired afterward. This is where the message begins to shift. Because although the warning is serious, it is not intended to create despair. In fact, Ripperger repeatedly emphasizes the opposite. The purpose of recognizing a threat is not fear, it is readiness. Fear paralyzes people. Clarity mobilizes them. And according to this message, clarity is exactly what is needed right now. That brings us to a question any viewers may be asking. If the situation is truly this serious, what can actually be done? The answer, according to Ripperger, is both simpler and more demanding than most people expect, because solutions rarely begin with society. They begin with individuals. They begin with families. They begin with daily habits. And that reality can feel disappointing because people often want dramatic answers to dramatic problems. They want sweeping cultural reforms. They want immediate transformations. They want solutions large enough to match the scale of the crisis. But history reveals something interesting. Most great renewals begin quietly. They begin with ordinary people making extraordinary commitments. That pattern appears again and again. Civilizations recover because individuals recover. Communities strengthen because families strengthen. Cultures change because people change. And according to this warning, That process must begin now rather than later. Why? Because waiting is itself a decision. Every day spent drifting is still movement. Every day spent unprepared still shapes the future. Every day spent assuming someone else will solve the problem transfers responsibility away from the very people capable of making a difference. This is where the message becomes deeply personal, because it is easy to discuss society. It is easy to discuss culture. It is easy to discuss institutions. But eventually every warning reaches a moment where the focus narrows to a single question. What are you going to do? Not what politicians will do, not what schools will do, not what churches will do. What will you do? That question is uncomfortable because it removes excuses. It shifts the conversation from analysis to action. And according to Ripperger, action begins with reclaiming the habits that strengthen the soul. Habits of reflection in a world of distraction. Habits of discipline in a world of convenience. Habits of truth in a world of confusion. Habits of commitment in a world of constant escape. None of these habits develop overnight. That is precisely why they matter. They require patience. They require consistency. They require the willingness to pursue long-term growth rather than short-term comfort. And here is something fascinating. The very things modern culture often treats as weaknesses are frequently the things that create strength. Silence strengthens attention. Sacrifice strengthens character. Prayer strengthens focus. Discipline strengthens freedom. Patience strengthens endurance. At first glance, these practices seem small. But small practices repeated consistently become powerful. A tree does not grow overnight. A foundation is not built in a day. A strong family is not formed in a week. Everything valuable develops through repetition. That truth leads directly to one of the most hopeful aspects of this entire message. Because if decline occurs gradually, renewal can occur gradually too. If habits can weaken people, habits can strengthen them. If culture can shape individuals, individuals can reshape culture. The process may be slower than people want, but it is also more realistic than many realize. History is filled with examples of small groups creating enormous impact because they remained committed when others surrendered. And that is exactly where Ripperger places his hope, not in perfect circumstances, not in ideal institutions, not in favorable trends, in people. In ordinary people willing to take their beliefs seriously, in families willing to build differently, in individuals willing to remain faithful when compromise appears easier. That hope is important because the message loses its meaning without it. Warnings matter only when action remains possible. And according to this warning, action is absolutely possible. The future is not fixed. The outcome is not predetermined. The challenges are real, but so is the capacity to respond. That is why the darkest part of this message is not the existence of spiritual struggle. Human history has always contained struggle. The darkest possibility is apathy. It is knowing what matters and doing nothing. It is recognizing the battle and refusing to engage. It is seeing the warning and assuming someone else will respond. Yet, the moment people reject apathy, everything changes, because awareness becomes preparation. Preparation becomes action. Action becomes transformation. And transformation spreads further than most people expect. So, as this message comes to a close, the question is no longer whether darkness exists. The question is whether people are willing to confront it with equal seriousness. The question is whether families will strengthen what has been neglected. The question is whether individuals will choose discipline over distraction, truth over confusion, courage over passivity. Because according to Father Chad Ripperger, that choice may define the years ahead. And perhaps that is the real reason this message matters. Not because it predicts disaster, not because it invites fear, but because it challenges people to wake up before circumstances force them to. The warning is serious. The stakes are real. But the final message is not despair. It is responsibility. It is readiness. It is perseverance. And above all, it is the conviction that no matter how dark a moment appears, people still possess the ability to choose a different path. The question is whether they will, and that decision begins today. Something influencing daily life far more than most people realize. And once you see it, you may never look at your home the same way again. To understand why, we need to examine what Ripperger calls one of the most underestimated spiritual dangers of the modern age. And that is where the story becomes even more disturbing